wondered why there are so many different definitions of inclusive education? Have you ever wondered where the term inclusive education comes from? So my name is Dr. Leanne Longfellow. I'm from Inclusive Education Planning, and Inclusive Education Planning is an organisation that supports schools, teachers and parents to provide socially just ways of educating students with a disability. Okay, so let's look at the definition of inclusive education. So, as I said before, there are very few people who can define inclusive education, and we're going to look at the reasons why that has occurred. And I am recording this from Kaurna country. I'm in Adelaide on Kaurna country. So here are some statements from teachers and assistants about what they thought inclusive education meant. So one person said, inclusion is about being really safe in a safe environment. And special schools are much safer than the mainstream. And that's quite a common belief, actually, that special schools are much safer than the mainstream. Here's another one, and I'd just like you to think about whether you agree with these. Inclusive education works when students with high needs have one-to-one support with an assistant to access the mainstream. And I often hear from teachers, assistants, and also from parents that they are concerned and feel that inclusive education would work if there was more funding for assistants. Here's another one, this idea that inclusion is a continuum of placements from mainstream through to special school placement. So this person believes that you can be included when you are in a special school, that special schools can be inclusive. And that's quite a common belief. What about this one? Not all students can be included in the mainstream. That's also a very common belief. And another one, special education is inclusive because if special schools did not exist, many children would not receive an education. So the problem with all of those statements is that they are not aligned with the universal definition of inclusive education, which I will introduce you to as we go along, as we move forward in this presentation. But we'll just have a quick look at Queensland. Queensland is the only state or territory in Australia that actually has an inclusive education policy. So none of the other states do. And within their policy, which was introduced in 2018, they state inclusive education means that all students can access and fully participate in learning alongside their similar age peers. Teaching and learning strategies are adjusted to meet students' individual needs. Inclusive education encompasses all aspects of school life and is supported by culture, policies, programs, and practices. So I quite like that definition of inclusion. But it's interesting how we only have one state that actually has a policy. And there's also a difference between policy and practice. So what is in policy doesn't necessarily translate to being in practice. And what we know is that over time, despite Australia signing all these human rights instruments regarding inclusive education, that the rate of segregated education, and that means children placed in special schools, special classes, disability units, the rate of that has gone up. And we currently have in Australia a long wait list for children wishing to attend a special school, or the parents wish their child to attend a special school. So there is a long wait list for that. But let's go back a bit to the first time that the term inclusive education was utilised. And this was in Spain at Salamanca. So they got together 92 representatives of different countries, and Australia was there. And they signed the Salamanca Statement, and that was in 1994. The very first time that the term inclusive education was utilised in international document. Prior to this, and certainly after the Second World War, there were a huge amount of human rights abuses of people with a disability, and abuse and neglect and violence. And there were great concerns throughout the world about how to address this. And one of the ways of addressing it is through inclusive education, because when we have inclusive schools, we have the end result as an inclusive, welcoming society. So in 1994, it was decided to actually formalise this and put this into a statement. So the Salamanca statement, within it, it says, the fundamental principle of the inclusive school is that all children should learn together wherever possible, regardless of any difficulties or differences they may have. Inclusive schools must recognise and respond to the diverse needs of their students, accommodating both different styles and rates of learning and ensuring quality education to all through appropriate curricula, organisational arrangements, teaching strategies, resource use and partnerships with their communities. There should be a continuum of support and services to match the continuum of special needs encountered in every school. So Australia was an early signatory to the Salamanca Statement, but there was a lot of trouble putting that into practice. So let's march forward to 2006, when the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was formulated, and Kevin Rudd signed that on behalf of Australia in 2008. So he signed it and it was ratified in 2008. So signing a document means that you're working through it, towards it. Ratification means that you, as a country, will be held accountable for the obligations within that. So some countries that really embraced inclusion include Italy. Italy disbanded segregated education in 1977. I believe that there are a small number of schools in Italy, but it is mostly an inclusive education and is held up as a role model to other nations. New Brunswick in Canada has removed segregated education, so they are also held up as a good example. Sweden as well, the majority of children with a disability are within general education, and they are supported within general education within Sweden. But Australia hasn't done so well, and neither has the UK, and neither has the US. And part of the problem was felt that the definition of inclusive education was a bit broad, and so it was implemented in different ways in different countries, and even within different states and locations within different countries. So in 2016, it was felt that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities needed to be clarified. So what was brought in was General Comment 4. And General Comment 4 clarifies what inclusive education is by defining what it is not. So let's have a look at this. So in General Comment 4, it defines what segregated education is. And that's where students learn in separate environments that are designed to respond to their particular needs. Students are often not educated with their same age peers. So segregated education is, special schools, special classes, disability units. So where children are segregated by ability. So gifted education is also a form of segregation. ESL classes can also be considered a form of segregation. And what we know is that the research fully supports inclusive education. So integration. So what often, when people say inclusion doesn't work, they're often referring to integration. So integration is a process of placing students with disability in existing mainstream educational institutions, as long as the form can adjust to the standardised requirements of the school. So what happens in integration is there might be a few minor changes, but they're always add-ons. So the culture of the school remains the same. And so it's quite tokenistic. So the child with a disability is placed in there. There are a few things change, but the culture hasn't changed. The child isn't valued. The child doesn't necessarily have a sense of belonging. And so this is what we call integration. So when people say inclusion doesn't work, generally what they're talking about is integration, which what we know is that integration doesn't have the same outcomes, positive outcomes, that inclusion has. So exclusion. I'm in South Australia and there is a very large number of children with a disability who are excluded from school. And that might be for a range of reasons, but primarily because of behaviour. Behaviour because of their disability, connected with their disability. And so children are excluded from school, and many parents are put in the position of being forced to homeschool. Some parents choose to homeschool, but there are also a large number of parents who it hasn't been a choice, it's been forced upon them. So exclusion, where students are directly or indirectly prevented from or denied access to education in any form. So inclusion. So we've learnt about segregation, integration and exclusion. So let's move on to what inclusion is. Inclusion is a process of systemic reform embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods and approaches, structures and strategies in education to overcome barriers, with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environment that best corresponds to their requirements and preferences. So it's where there's a change in culture and the child is valued and they have a sense of belonging. So they are a part of everything that happens in the class, and they can access an age-appropriate curriculum alongside their non-disabled peers. So let's have a look at some case studies of what's happening in education and work out what you think it is, whether it is segregation, whether it is integration, whether it is exclusion, or whether it is inclusion. So the first one, Ella. Ella is 5 years old and she loves music, dancing and butterflies. Ella attends a special school. So what would you say that is? How would you characterise that? Is it segregation? Is it integration? Is it exclusion, or is it inclusion? And this is an example of segregated education. Ella is educated alongside other children who are disabled. And so she doesn't have the opportunity to learn beside her non-disabled peers. Let's have a look at another one. Ollie. Ollie is 10 years old. His behaviour is his way of telling everyone when he is overwhelmed with sensory issues. He was recently suspended from school and is currently at home for an indefinite period. So what would you say that is? Is that segregated education? Is it integrated, excluded, or inclusive education? If you chose excluded, you are correct. Ollie is excluded from education. So he doesn't have the opportunity to learn alongside his peers. So they're getting a bit more complex here. Jonah is 15 and has a disability. He attends his local mainstream high school. Jonah has support through a one-to-one teacher assistant in the classroom. He sits with his assistant at the back of the classroom working on tasks that are individualised for Jonah, but are different from the rest of the class. Jonah also has support in the playground. At recess and lunchtime, the teacher assistant gathers the students with disability together and organises activities for them as a group so they are not on their own. So this is a tricky one. So Jonah is attending his local high school, but he's one-to-one with his assistant. And what we know from the research is that unless there is a specific need for a child to have a one-to-one assistant, it's best not to do that, not to have an assistant sitting right beside a child, because that creates learned helplessness. It also interferes in the child receiving instruction from the teacher, and it interferes with friendships and social connections in the classroom. In fact, there is research that indicates that students who have an assistant right beside them when they don't need that can regress in their learning. And whilst assistants do an amazing job, the way that they are utilised is not always helpful. And the employment of assistants to assist students with a disability came about because of the disability standards and children's right to an education when they have a disability. But the way that they are deployed doesn't lead to strong educational academic outcomes or social outcomes for students with a disability. It interferes with education. So Jonah has an assistant. He's on the back of the classroom. He's working on tasks that are individualised for Jonah, but different from the rest of the class. And in an inclusive education, a child would access the same curriculum as the other children. It would be individualised in so that they can, it would be scaffolded and adjusted so they could access it, but it wouldn't be completely different. But Jonah has a curriculum that is completely different. And then we have in the playground, instead of Jonah being able to play alongside his non-disabled peers, he and other students gathered together, and this often happens because of funding. So gathered together, and not by choice. If it's by choice, that's perfectly okay. But when children are grouped together based on ability and it is not their choice, then it is problematic. So these children are grouped together for activities for the convenience of funding. And so how would you describe this type of education? Would you describe this as segregated, integrated, excluded, or included? Some of you might say integration, and yes, there is an element of that where Jonah is integrated into the mainstream, but you might also say segregated. So it might be, a bit of both, and where he is segregated within the playground from his non-disabled peers. So let's have a look at another one. Georgia is 7 and she loves eating chocolate and playing computer games. She's in a junior primary special class, but every morning attends a buddy class in the mainstream as a guest. How would you describe this one? Is it integration? Is it segregation, exclusion, or inclusion? So Georgia is going to a buddy class as a guest. Now, if it was inclusive, it would be a full-time enrolment in the class, in the general education class. A child wouldn't be considered a guest. They would be a member of the class, and they'd be a welcomed member of the class and a valued member of the class. So Georgia is just a guest, so she doesn't really belong. So, and most of the time she's in a junior primary special class. So how would you describe that? Is that segregation, integration, exclusion, or inclusion? So I would describe it largely as a segregated education. Here's another one, Maddie. Maddie is 16 and has severe multiple disabilities and communicates with her eyes. She is non-speaking. She attends her local mainstream high school where she feels a sense of belonging and has a voice. Maddie has a small group of friends in her year level, and she socialises both inside and outside of the school with this group. Maddie has adjustments and supports in order to work on the same curriculum as the other students. There is an assistant in the classroom, but Maddie receives her instruction mostly from the teacher, just like all the other students. So how would you describe this? Is this segregation? Is this integration? Is this exclusion? Or is this inclusion? I would describe this as inclusion. So Maddie is socialises, has friendships in the class. She works on the same curriculum as the other students. There's an assistant in the room because obviously Maddie would need help with her personal care and just all of those types of things. But the assistant isn't right beside Maddie until she needs it, until she needs assistance. And Maddie receives her instruction from the teacher. And what we know is that a lot of students with disabilities actually receive their instruction from an assistant rather than from the teacher. So this is an example of inclusion. So here's another one. Riley is 13 and has a physical disability. He attends his local mainstream high school. He participates in most of the classes as his same age peers, apart from science lessons, which are upstairs. There is no lift, so Riley cannot attend science. Instead, the principal asked Riley's mum to pick him up and take him home, as the school is unable to support Riley in this time. So how would you describe that? Is that segregation, integration, exclusion, or inclusion? So while Riley attends a mainstream high school, he's not able to have a full-time enrolment, and he's largely segregated, isn't he? So, so you might say integration, and you might say, you know, there's certainly segregation, and you could also argue that he is excluded from the science lesson. So, so it's also partial exclusion, and that is not a good thing. So children are entitled to a full education, regardless of their disability. They are entitled to a full-time enrolment and access to everything that their non-disabled peers can access. So let's look at what's happening in Australia and how some countries are able to implement inclusive education, but Australia hasn't. And so let's unpack what actually happened there. So despite ratifying in 2008, Australia ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Australia still provides segregated education for students with disabilities. And so that's really interesting. There's lots of policies on inclusion. We have a Royal Commission into violence, abuse and neglect of students or of people with disability. And they've looked at inclusive education and they're recommending inclusive education, but it just hasn't happened. And the Royal Commission have put out a number of papers about inclusive education, and they started their Royal Commission looking at inclusive education. So one of the interesting things in the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992 is a thing called Section 45. So Section 45 is where it refers to special measures. So within Australian legislation, there is this clause called special measures where segregated education is lawful within our country, and it is called special measures. And there's also this thing called gatekeeping, and gatekeeping is where parents are deterred from enrolling their child in their local school within general education. It's illegal under Section 22 of the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act of 1992, and that states that an educational authority cannot discriminate on the grounds of disability by refusing or failing to accept the person's application for admission as a student or in the terms or conditions on which it is prepared to admit the person as a student. But what often happens is that schools will say, well, you know, there's this wonderful school down the road, this special school, and your child will be better catered for there. And of course, parents do not want to enrol their child in a school where their child will not be welcomed and valued. So, of course, many parents choose to do that. And it's not a real choice, actually, is it? If parents are presented with a school that indicates that they do not want that child in the school, and then there's a special school that is very well funded, then it's not really a choice of, two equal settings. It's our society is set up that it's a vicious cycle that we have special schools and segregated education. Another clause within the disability standards of education, and that is a subset of the DDA, and it clarifies about education for students with disability. So there is a clause around unjustifiable hardship. So if the enrolment of a child with a disability would cause unjustifiable hardship for a school, then there is that clause that they can use. So there's two clauses there that are a way of schools manoeuvring around their responsibility. And when I say that, there are many schools who embrace children with disability, and they do that very well. But there are also, from the research, it's very, very clear that there are schools who utilise the legislation and the fact that we have a dual system of education. We have our mainstream education and we have our special schools, and there are principles that suggest to parents that their child would be better off in a special school placement. So some key takeaways of this presentation. The key takeaways are that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities affirms the rights of people with disabilities. So a child with a disability has human rights over and above their non-disabled peers. So there's a whole lot of human rights instruments that Australia has signed and ratified. The most robust definition of inclusive education is within the UN CRPD, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It took until 2016 for human rights instruments to decide upon a clear, simple and precise definition of inclusive education. So that's probably led to a great deal of confusion. So when General Comment 4 was implemented, it defined not only what inclusive education is, but what it is not. And what it is not is segregation, integration and exclusion. And that has been very helpful in defining what inclusive education is. So we don't have all these different versions of inclusive education, that there's only one version of inclusive education. So Australia has not yet complied with the obligations to provide inclusive education within the UN CRPD. Australia draws on many definitions of inclusive education rather than the one universal definition by the UN CRPD. So many teachers and schools are unaware of the definition of inclusive education in the UN CRPD. And so that's why we have all these different definitions floating around, and that is not helpful. The Disability Discrimination Act of 1992 and the Disability Standards for Education in 2005 contain clauses that legally permit segregated education for students with disability. This is at odds with the definition of inclusion within the UN CRPD. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation.